Continuing Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. We're in program 5 of Pyrrhus. With these pretensions, amusing those who came to meet him in his march. As soon as ever he entered Laconia, he began to plunder and waste the country. And on the ambassadors complaining that he began the war upon them before it was proclaimed, "We know," said he, "very well that neither do you Spartans, when you design anything, talk of it beforehand." One Mandorclidas, then present, told him in the broad Spartan dialect, "If you are a god, you will do us no harm. We are wronging no man, but if you are a man, there may be another stronger than you." He now marched away directly for Lacedaemon, and being advised by Cleonymus to give the assault as soon as he arrived, fearing, as it is said, lest the soldiers, entering by night, should plunder the city, he answered, they might do it as well the next morning, because there were but few soldiers in town, and those unprovided against his sudden approach, as Pyrrhus was not there in person, but gone to aid the Gortonians in Crete, and it was this alone that saved the town, because he despised as it not tenable, and, so imagining no defense would be made, he sat down before it that night. Cleonymus's friends and the Helots, his domestic servants, had made great preparation at his house, as expecting Pyrrhus there at supper. Now, one of the best Tad songs is Helot. In the night, the Lacedaemonians held a consultation to ship over all the women in Crete, but they unanimously refused. Archidamia came into the Senate with a sword in her hand, in the name of them all, asking if the men expected the women to survive the ruins of Sparta. It was next resolved to draw a trench in a line directly over against the enemy's camp, and here and there in it to sink wagons in the ground as deep as the naves of the wheel, that so being firmly fixed, they might obstruct the passage of the elephants. When they had just begun the work, both maids and women came to them. The married women, with their robes tied, like girdles round their underfrocks, and unmarried girls, in their single frocks only, to assist the elder men in their work. As for the youth that were next day to engage, they left them to the rest, and undertaking their proportion, they themselves finished a third part of the trench, which was in breach 6 cubits 4 in depth, and 800 feet long, as Plutarch says. Hieronymus makes it somewhat less. The enemies beginning to move by break of day, they brought their arms to the young men, and giving them also in charge the trench, exhorted them to defend and keep it bravely, as it would be happy for them to conquer, in the view of their whole country, and glorious to die in the arms of their mothers and wives, falling as came Spartans. As for Chelonice, she retired with a halter about her neck, resolving to die so rather than fall into the hands of Cleonymus if the city were taken. Pyrrhus himself in person advanced with his foot to force through the shields of the Spartans ranged against him, and to get over the trench, which was scarce passable, because the looseness of the fresh earth afforded no firm footing for the soldiers. Ptolemy his son, 2,000 Gauls, and some choice men of the Chaonians went round the trench, and endeavored to get over where the wagons were, but they, being so deep in the ground and placed close together, not only made his passage, but also the defense of the Lacedaemonians very troublesome. Yet now the Gauls had got the wheels out of the ground, and were drawing off the wagons towards the river, when young Acrotatus, seeing the danger, and passing through the towns with 300 men, surrounding Ptolemy undiscerned, taking advantage of some slopes of the ground until he fell upon his rear and forced him to wheel about, and thrusting one another into the ditch, and falling among the wagons at last, with much loss, not without difficulty they withdrew. The elderly men and all the women saw this brave action of Acrotatus, and when he returned back into the town, to the first post, all covered with blood, and fierce, and elate with victory, he seemed to the Spartan women to have become taller and more beautiful than before, and they envied Cleinias, so worthy a lover, and some of the old men followed him, crying aloud, "Go on, Acrotatus, be happy with Cleinias, and beget brave sons for Sparta." When Pyrrhus himself fought was the hottest of the action, and many of the Spartans did gallantly, but in particular one Phyleus signalized himself, made the best resistance, and killed most assailants. And when he found himself ready to sink with the many wounds he had received, retiring a little out of his place behind another, he fell among his fellow soldiers, that the enemy might not carry off his body. The fight ended with the day, and Pyrrhus in his sleep dreamed that he drew thunderbolts upon Lacedaemon, and set it all on fire, and rejoiced at the sight, and waking in this transport of joy, he commanded his officers to get all things ready for a second assault, and relating his dream among his friends, supposing it to mean that he should take the town by storm, the rest assented to it with admiration, but Lysimachus was not pleased with the dream, and told him he feared lest, as places struck with lightning are held sacred, and not to be trodden upon, so the entities might by this let him know that the city should not be taken. Pyrrhus replied that all these things were but idle talk, full of uncertainty, and only fit to amuse the vulgar. Their thought, with their swords in their hands, should always be, "The one good omen is King Pyrrhus's cause," and so got up and drew out his army to the walls by break of day. The Lacedaemonians, in resolution and courage, made a defense even beyond their power. The women were all by, helping them to arms, and bringing bread and drink to those that desired it, and taking care of the wounded. The Macedonians attempted to fill up the trench, bringing huge quantities of materials and throwing them upon the arms and dead bodies that lay there and were covered over, while Lacedaemonians opposed this with all their force. Pyrrhus in person appeared on their side of the trench and wagons, pressing on horseback toward the city, at which the men who had the post calling out, and the women shrieking and running about, while Pyrrhus violently pushed on and beat down all that disputed his way. His horse received a shot in the belly from a Cretan arrow, and his convulsions as he died threw off Pyrrhus on slippery and steep ground. And it's not good, people, to do, to defile the dead bodies, or let people bury their dead, and all about him being in confusion at this, as the Spartans came boldly up, and making good use of their missiles, forced them off again. After this, Pyrrhus and other quarters also put an end to the combat, imagining the Lacedaemonians would be inclined to yield, as almost all of them were wounded, and very great numbers killed outright. But the good fortune of the city, either satisfied with the experiment upon the bravery of the citizens, or willing to prove how much even in the last extremities such interposition may effect, brought, when the Lacedaemonians had now but very slender hopes left, Aminius the Phocian, one of Antigonus's commanders, from Corinth, to their assistance with a force of mercenaries, and they were no sooner received into the town, but Ardeus, their king, arrived there himself too, from Crete, with 2,000 men more. The women, upon this, went all home to their houses, finding it no longer necessary for them to meddle with the business of the war, and they also were sent back, who, though not of military age, were by necessity forced to take arms, while the rest prepared to fight Pyrrhus. He, upon the coming of these additional forces, was indeed possessed with a more eager desire and ambition than before to make himself master of the town, but his designs not succeeding, and receiving fresh losses every day, he gave over the siege and fell to plundering the country, determining to winter thereabout. But fate is unavoidable, and a great feud happening at Argos between Aristeas and Aristippus, two principal citizens, after Aristippus had resolved to make use of the friendship of Antigonus, Aristeas, to anticipate him, invited Pyrrhus thither, he always revolving hopes upon hopes, and treating all his successes as occasions of more, and his reverses as defeats to be amended by new enterprises, allowed neither losses nor victories to limit him in his receiving or giving trouble, and so presently went for Argos. Argus, by frequent ambushes and seizing positions where the ways were most unpracticable, harassed the Gauls and Molossians that brought up the rear. It had been told Pyrrhus by one of the priests that found the liver of the sacrificed beast imperfect, that some of his near relations would be lost. Now, you can interpret this on the other side too, In this tumult and disorder of the rear, forgetting the prediction, he commanded out his son Ptolemy with some of his guards to their assistance, while he himself led on the main body rapidly out of the pass. And the fight being very warm where Ptolemy was, for the most select men of the Lacedaemonians, commanded by Avaucus, were there engaged. One Orestes of Aptera in Crete, a stout man and swift of foot, running on one side of the young prince as he was fighting bravely, gave him a mortal wound and slew him. On his fall, those about him turned their backs, and the Lacedaemonian horse, pursuing and cutting off many, got into the open plain, and found themselves engaged with the enemy before they were aware, without their infantry. Pyrrhus, who had received the ill news of his son, and was in great affliction, drew out his Molossian horse against them, and, charging at the head of his men, satiated himself with the blood and slaughter of the Lacedaemonians, as indeed he always showed himself a terrible and invincible hero in actual fight. But now he exceeded all that he had ever done before in courage and force. Gotta keep trying for better, right? On his riding his horse up to Avaucus, he, by declining a little to one side, had almost cut off Pyrrhus's hand, in which he held the reins, but lighting on the reins, only cut them. At the same instant Pyrrhus, running him through with his spear, fell from his horse, and there on foot, as he was proceeded to slaughter all those choice men that fought about the body of Avaucus, a severe additional loss to Sparta, incurred after the war itself was now at an end, by the mere animosity of the commanders. Pyrrhus, having thus offered as it were a sacrifice to the ghost of his son, and fought a glorious battle in honor of his obsequies, and, having vented much of his pain in action against the enemy, marched away to Argos. Obsequies. And having intelligence that Antigonus was already in possession of the high grounds, he encamped about Nauplia, and the next day dispatched a herald to Antigonus, calling him a villain, and challenging him to descend into the plain field and fight with him for the kingdom. He answered that if his conduct should be measured by times as well as by arms, that if Pyrrhus had no leisure to live, there were ways enough open to death. To both kings also came ambassadors from Argos, desiring each party to retreat and allow the city to remain in friendship with both, without falling into the hands of either. Antigonus was persuaded and sent his son as a hostage to the Argives, but Pyrrhus, although he consented to retire, yet he sent no hostage, was suspected. A remarkable portent happened at this time to Pyrrhus. The heads of the sacrificial oxen, laying apart from bodies, were seen to thrust out their tongues and lick up their own gore, and in the city of Argos, the priestess of Apollo, Lycias, rushed out of the temple, crying she saw the city full of carcasses and slaughter, and an eagle coming out to fight, and presently vanishing again. And in the dead of night, Pyrrhus, approaching the walls, and finding the gate called Camp Pyrrhus, set open for them by Aristeas, was undiscovered long enough to allow all his Gauls to enter and take possession of the marketplace. But the gate being too low to let in the elephants, they were obliged to take down the towers which they carried on their backs, and put them on again in the dark and in disorder, so that time being lost, the city took the alarm, and the people ran, some to Espes, the chief citadel, and other places of defense, and sent away Antigonus to assist them.